Hi, Terry. Hi, Michael. How are you all?
Hi there, welcome everyone.
Hello.
Well, not a huge amount to report this week. I have added some more detail into the views and viewpoints, so hopefully we can start to progress that a little bit further. Let me just cut across and show you what I've been working on. So I have filled in some details around CEO and CTO roles, marketing director, and a number of other things like product manager, delivery manager, CDA roles. So all of these now have some content in them. So we're starting to build up a picture of the key roles and responsibilities. Now, obviously, there's still quite a lot of gaps in here, both in terms of things that have yet to be filled out, and also I think we're probably missing a few stakeholder roles in here still. So if anyone would like to contribute, feel free to add a PR onto this branch. Now, in terms of other activities and involvement, it might help to understand what people are interested in, and where you feel you might be able to contribute on this piece of work. So feel free to jump in and let me know your feelings on that.
Sure, I can go. So from my end, I think my background is significantly more sort of hands-on keyboard technical. So when it comes to sort of some of those things, I think I'd be interested in kind of doing a little bit of that. But also, I think there was a few things in there that I saw that might be useful because I also have a background in working at a lot of banks, and so understanding sort of compliance, audit, legal requirements is also really good from the CD sort of perspective. And then, my other thing more from the technical side is I have a background in doing a lot of stuff on the supply chain security side as well.
Okay, that sounds good. And to reiterate what we're doing here, we've had a lot of focus on the pipeline end of continuous delivery, but actually it's really important to know what you should be putting in your pipelines, and so having that understanding at an organizational level makes it much easier to have conversations about continuous delivery in the context of a business, and be able to show where it adds value outside of just the engineering team.
Yeah, agreed on that. That's actually separately something that they're also very interested in is like that sort of end-to-end software delivery lifecycle piece of that sort of thing of like what goes in, what comes out, and not just purely the technical side of it, but also like where are those decisions getting logged and like the thing that you want to make sure of, right, is just as an example, nothing with an incorrect license should be allowed in the first place, before you get, like, which is one of the problems, right? Is working at several banks, that sort of thing gets caught, 2 days before production. You go, oh wait, there's some this should have been caught earlier.
Yeah, and there's also quite a lot of stuff which is invisible. If you're used to working in a product team, then you're not necessarily getting any visibility of the activity that goes on across product teams within an organization. And so there's an awful lot of significant work that goes into aligning the market positioning of a suite of products, and making sure that you've got consistent messaging and that you're using terminology in the same way, that your branding is consistent, and all of those pieces that are invisible from the inside, but actually span across all the product teams at a higher level. And there's a bunch of that which it can be included in the governance processes of your continuous delivery approach. So this is the first cut across this reference architecture, and this part is just about establishing who are the players in any given organization in terms of needing a stake in that delivery process. And what are their views and viewpoints? How are they seeing the problem? What's important to them? Because when we move on to the next step, we're going to be looking at their individual concerns and how those need to play into the automation that we start to build in order to get a successful overarching process. So, Michael, is there anything in that list of views and viewpoints that you feel you'd be comfortable to fill out, given the sort of reference examples that we've now got for some of the other ones?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so if you were going to pick one or two of those views and viewpoints pages to actually fill out, what would you feel comfortable working on?
So let me just double check here. Yeah, so let me go and see. So I could probably do auditor and security engineer, or actually security engineer already done. Oh yeah, so auditor and security engineer are probably the two that I could probably do.
Okay, great. Yeah, feel free to have a stab at those. If you read through the other ones, you'll see I've taken a sort of style for structuring them. So the first part is a sort of third-party description of what the viewpoint is. What does this general rule do? And then the second part is written from the perspective of the person in that role, saying what they're most concerned about. And then the third part is what benefits are added by the continuous delivery process. And that's something that we can all add to, so we can contribute to filling those out. Okay, well, happy for you to have a stab at those. You can clone the branch and put a PR, or you can just send me copies of the documents if you don't want to go through the hoops of managing it that way, and I'll add them in.
Cool. Yeah, no. I'm going to fork it right now and take a look a little bit later.
Okay. Anyone else interested in either contributing or just giving us a feel for what your interests are and what you'd like to see? Okay, no volunteers. All right, well, I don't have anything else to particularly discuss today, so does anyone else have anything they want to get on the agenda?
So not for this week, but in the coming weeks, I think one of the things that we want to oh yeah, so actually I can talk about the thing that real quickly that Kara just posted in chat. So Tim, who's one of my colleagues, so we for the issue 243, one of the things was it was unclear where abstractions falls under some of the best practices and some of these other things that are kind of coming out, right? So there was a blog article by, let me remember who it was, that's on the CD Foundation by Justin from eBay regarding sort of intent-based pipelines. There's some stuff that's sort of coming out, like there's a tool from OpenSSF, which disclosure I'm a lead on, called Fresca, which sort of takes Tekton and all these other tools and sort of builds an abstraction that's sort of saying, hey, here's Tekton, here's all these things, and then here's a way that you can only run it securely. Like it doesn't let you do the bad thing. And there's stuff like Dagger.io. There's things that are kind of coming out. There's like one or two other ones that I saw that are similar to sort of like Dagger, which is trying to say, oh, Ployghost from Red Hat, which sort of says you could use Jenkins, you could use Tekton, whatever, but here's a higher level abstraction that generates those CI tools, and also tries to do that SDLC kind of thing, like what you're sort of describing here is, you know, here's the best practices and how do we codify that as essentially an abstraction. So whether it's people process or literal automation for that thing, how can folks, like what does that look like from the CD Foundation perspective? Just to give you the summary.
Thank you, Michael. That is really helpful. Do you mind putting the name of the other tool that you mentioned, the Red Hat tool? Because I'm not familiar with it, either in this chat or on that that issue, just so I can keep an eye on it.
Sure, I'll do it both.
Okay, thank you. And then how do you think, sort of hijacking this right now, but since you've been so cooperative to talk more about it, how do you think this should sort of be encompassed? All these new tools that are coming out that are really interesting, we should have them on the landscape. Like how best to place that?
I'm not sure. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to reach out regarding this. Is it's almost like some folks are looking at codifying the software delivery lifecycle as itself sort of an abstraction. You can imagine like similar to if you've ever used tools like ServiceNow, right? ServiceNow lets you sort of develop a workflow for when when a new project gets spun up, these are the things that happen, and they get a budget and they get a naming scheme and all that great stuff. And then when they go into get ready to do development, they automatically get like a GitHub or whatever, like code repositories. And then when they go to deploy to staging, this is what that looks like, and so on and so forth. And some of the things that are starting to kind of come out of this is, how do we, like, traditionally, if you look at places that has been very important, so in regulated industries like banking, energy, et cetera, that sort of process is often very much, it's a lot of people, a lot of emails. Even with stuff like ServiceNow, it's still like somebody clicks a button to approve and yada yada. But what's kind of coming out of this, and what's coming out of stuff like Ployghost, what's coming out of stuff like Fresca, is some additional sorts of tools that are trying to say, what if we codified all this based on some of these new things that are coming out, like salsa attestation? So what if you just sort of said, and CD events and some of these other things, like what if you said, well, if I have a SALTA attestation and I have it assigned to SBOM and I have these other metadata things, I have a security scan, what if you just sort of said, great, it checks all the boxes, you get to go into production. Or it checks all the boxes, which allows somebody to actually click the button to send it to production. Those sorts of things of like codifying that at some level is kind of where that's starting to go. And I'm not sure what we're calling that, but that's kind of the way that we've been seeing people push.
Yeah, and I think this is quite an interesting area for discussion, because it really touches on the big differences between the cultures of the two different types of organizations. So, obviously the continuous delivery methodology comes from that lean startup model, which is all about optimizing the pace at which you can do experiments in real world environments. Whereas the traditional governance processes come from a very risk averse view of the world, where everything is forbidden unless it's explicitly mandated. And there's not necessarily a good fit of continuous delivery to the latter culture. So the challenge in practice is that most of the benefits of continuous delivery come from the overarching business methodology that allows you to move very quickly. And if you can't bring those culture changes into your organization, there's an argument to say you probably shouldn't be trying to use continuous delivery as an engineering methodology, because your organization is going to fight itself. Now, the key piece about this is that continuous delivery is not about living with increased risk. It's about assuming that there will always be significant risks that you cannot anticipate or mitigate, and therefore your only safe strategy is to be able to react very quickly to unexpected situations and remediate them as fast as possible. So it's a case of saying we expect everything to blow up, and we are able to react to that instantly, roll something back, get a fix in place, and roll that out again in a matter of hours. And therefore our overall business exposure is actually lower than in a situation where we've been very risk averse. It takes us 6 months to deploy something, and then we still encounter something we didn't expect, and now it's going to take us a year to get a fix in place to react to it. So I think there is certainly more to be done within the best practices documentation to really get that message across, that you are looking at two opposite positions on a continuum. And whilst there is some wiggle room at both ends of that continuum, it's very hard to sit in the middle. And so there is a significant risk of trying to do part of this without bringing all of the culture that comes with it.
Yeah, that's that all makes sense to me. I think that's the thing that we're trying to also get across, and it's something that's coming also out of, I think, a little bit of the like this space, which is just like you're also starting to apply zero trust rules to your entire SDLC, where you're saying before you were doing a lot of just different things, a lot of very risk averse things. But now you're saying, hey, you can actually get a lot of lift by saying who is actually responsible for what are their, what do we trust them to do in what contexts and so on, to then be able to sort of say, here's how we can safely deliver stuff while you still know who did what, and no unauthorized person was able to kind of get in and write code or get in and run a build, get in and approve a thing or whatever.
Yeah, and the thing that we need to keep in mind is that as we're trying to implement that, it needs to be done in a way that is still facilitating the very rapid experimentation process that the methodology is built upon. Because if you segment too much, then you're going back to a situation where you need a different team for every function. Each team has its own set of roles, and then suddenly you're back into dependency management hell again, because you've got lots of teams working in isolation, and you no longer have a product team.
Yeah. So I think that was the just to tie that back. Yeah. So I think that's the majority of the stuff from the landscaping side is just like, hey, as we build out the best practices, I think it's like some of what we, even just sort of looking at the organization, it's like, how do you, how does one begin to like, once we figure that sort of stuff out, I think people are going to start asking, okay, how do I codify those sorts of things, like the roles and what those roles should be doing in some sort of way that I feel a little bit safer about making sure that, yes, the auditor is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing in these ways. And so I can actually keep track that, yes, they did their job and that the security engineer did their job and so on, which is kind of where some of these tools are kind of coming from is, the Deployghost one in particular is one that is trying to say, hey, I can say that any piece of software should have these checks by these people in these order and so on.
Yeah. Now, I think one of the things that we need to be thinking about here is that, in that sort of classic software development lifecycle model, you are splitting the world up into the development team and everyone else. And the development team is saying, this is ready to go. And everyone else is saying, no, it isn't, because we haven't even looked at it yet. And so you get this problem that there's a team that's been working on this for X amount of time, and nobody else has been paying any attention. And then you want to put it live, and then suddenly a lot of people will say, no, not until we've given it some attention. But actually, we can't schedule that attention for another 3 or 4 weeks. And then we're going to spend a month on it. And so the structure of all those independent teams is optimized to serve the needs of the individual teams, not the needs of the product and the business. So instead, with continuous delivery, what you need to do is say, we have a set of standards for releasing things. As part of that, we will verify that each release process adheres to those standards. That process will make certain attestations about the quality of different aspects of this. And those will be provided to stakeholders and their teams who have an interest in each of those areas. But it's their responsibility to be engaged with the product team during the development process, not after the development process. And that attestation should be taken as a an appropriate indicator of quality to allow you to go straight into production, assuming you've been engaged at the right points in the process early on and have validated that the automated testing that goes on meets your needs from that perspective. It's about making people do the work up front and having the go live be a fixed point in time that that people don't get to extend beyond.
Yeah, that all lines up, and it's actually lining up with some stuff I've been writing personally on that topic. So I'm glad to know that in good company here.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things in here where success in this area mean inverting the current model that's going on in an organization. And so it's easy to kind of breeze over some of this when you're used to working in a continuous delivery environment. But actually, for a lot of the audience, we need to be really explicit and say, this stuff only works if you turn your existing process inside out. And if you're not capable of doing that, really don't try and do this at all, because you're going to get into a horrible mess.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I think the only other thing I was going to just sort of add is for Fresca, which is the OpenSSF tool, is we are trying to kind of take a piece of that and put that into the actual, like from a technical perspective. And we're trying to be very broad right now, because we are sort of looking to see what comes out of a combination of best practices, the CD events, some of the other things that are coming out of this supply chain stuff from CD. We want to see what comes out of there. But the thing that we are looking to do is we already have some mechanisms to help enable folks to, assuming they can take that approach with their organization, right? Of sort of abstracting that stuff and taking kind of that, like, it reminds me a lot of what you've described, reminds me a lot of at least reading through some of the Google SRE book and some of these other things of like how Google approaches this problem of it being a lot of that like zero trust of like, hey, these are the people who are authorized to do certain things. I don't, it's the way that risk calculations are, done a little bit differently, where it is more of that. It's significantly more of a like it's less of the like complete risk averse, like no, we can't have anything. It's more of like no, well, let's look at what we're trying to protect. This is what we're trying to protect. So this means, well, if it costs more to protect that thing than it does of the cost of losing that thing, like are we really actually gaining anything in stuff along those lines? And because like the things that we're looking to sort of do there, right, is make sure that, as we pull in software, like you can sort of say, here's the policy for pulling in software, here's the policy for licensing, here's the policy for all these different pieces. And so at the end of the build, you also get some additional sort of checks, like the inputs of the build are all of those things. The outputs of the build are additional attestations that you followed all the rules for your organization.
Yeah. And that's one of the important pieces that will come out of this reference architecture work, is that class of thinking that says, okay, there are multiple stakeholders involved here. Each stakeholder has their own area of concern, and they are going to be quite tunnel vision on their part of the problem, because that's what they're being measured on and that's what they're being rewarded on. But actually, continuous delivery is about achieving the overarching outcomes for the organization and for the customer. And so part of that continuous delivery process is in reconciling the stakeholder views into a way that optimizes the delivery of product to the customer. And that will always be on a case-by-case basis, because there will be different risk profiles for each feature of each product, and there will be very different concerns at the very different stages of the life cycle of the business. So those need to be taken into account, and you need to be able to mature your process over time, because what you need to do on day one of a new startup is very, very different from what you need to do on day 10,000 of a cash cow product in a large mature organization. And so it's having the right set of thinking tools to say, where are we on this continuation as an organization? Which things are important to us, and how do those fit into the automated release process that we need right now? And how are we going to revisit and change that process over the next 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, well, I think we can certainly do more. Some of that is going to come out naturally as part of the next few stages of this process. Once we get through this phase and we've got the basic details there, the first part of this I expect to be in the section on drivers and constraints. So we start to flag up the fact that there's conflict between stakeholders, and that you always have to balance off different views in each situation, and then we can expand on that as we move into the business architecture.
Yeah, and I think also along those lines, so one of the things that's coming out of the OpenSSF's, what do they call it? Is it their roadmap? Like it's they have a bunch of things that they're trying to kind of hit with for just open source security. And one of the things I think we're also looking at is how can we better collaborate with the other Linux Foundation groups like the CD Foundation to say, for example, if we take that reference architecture that's coming out of that way, if we take sort of the cloud native build practices that are coming out of the CNCF, all these things, combine them into something that then the OpenSSF can start to really push for others to really start to address, and even maybe show, like from the open source perspective, like, hey, like a lot of what you're describing makes sense for also, companies of any size, right? Smaller companies are going to apply it maybe slightly different than larger companies. But I think one of the other things that folks are starting to ask is, hey, how does this start to apply to open source projects as well? And that maybe don't have those same sorts of resources, and potentially can the OpenSSF come in and say, well, we'll help run almost like a SDLC for you, like we'll provide resources for the licensing sorts of stuff. We'll provide the, some of the stuff from the perspective of, what was it? What was the other thing? Like some of the other things that you sort of listed out, right? Like security engineering or some of the other roles there, as well as just generally like the stuff that isn't, I guess open source sometimes gets a bad rep that is just, oh, it's only hands-on keyboard. And how do we make sure that folks also recognize, no, we're looking at this also from the perspective of how do we enable open source to be able to do those things that make people feel more comfortable with using open source, because they feel like, it's not just one person in a basement somewhere writing some code and now lots of people, rely on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come back to that in a sec. Cara, did you want to jump in here?
No, I'm enjoying this conversation. Keep going.
Okay. I mean, I think the open source question is an interesting one because when you sit back and look at it, continuous delivery is not actually a good fit to building open source projects, because open source projects tend to be developers scratching their own itches, and they tend to grow because you attract a bunch of developers with the same problem who all want to evolve a technical solution to that problem. But that's not what continuous delivery is all about. Continuous delivery is about optimizing the ability of an organization to address its customers' needs, driven by the customer, not by the organization. So there tends to be a lot of anti-patterns in open source projects that don't align to the behaviors that you should be doing if you're actually doing continuous delivery. Hence why the way we're documenting this is focused on the commercial customer, because that's what this is actually for. Now you can adopt some of those techniques and you can benefit from a bunch of the tools, but you're not necessarily going to see those massive gains in productivity that the DORA metrics promise, because those derive primarily from your ability to react better in the marketplace and to be much more customer driven.
Yeah, I think that so that actually answers a lot of questions, and I think that that's actually a really really good point. I think that there's potentially some areas where I do think the Linux Foundation is trying to take a little bit more of that approach, where they are trying to say, hey, look, how do we become a bit more customer focused, as in like just the end users of, let's say, Kubernetes or something like that. But I agree with you that generally that does not fit for, the, hey, I wrote a little library for myself and somebody, and now it's being used by people. So anyway, thanks for that.
And that's part of what we're looking at doing now within the CDF is taking more of a view on, who are the actual customers for continuous delivery, and how do we use those principles to improve what we do in addressing those customer needs. So it's becoming much more a case of applying that methodology to everything that the foundation is doing to get it much more focused on what the customers need from continuous delivery. And I think that opens up a new way of looking at open source, in that it provides a different sort of demand signal for open source projects, because it says, here are real customers with real problems, and those customers may prefer an open solution that's built to standards and is widely adopted, rather than building a bespoke solution. So they're potentially willing to fund the development of open source projects as a way of getting access to those capabilities in the form of tools.
Cool.
Yeah, feel free
sense.
to jump in.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying, Tara, is that, or is it right that this means there is very hard to make one solution, and because each customer will have be at various paths in their technical maturity, and so it's kind of very hard to make one recipe, and the job becomes much more a job where you actually need to go in and talk to the customer, understand what they're doing, what are their goals and all this, before you try to give them a tool.
Yeah, that's very true. Now, what you can do is look at particular segments of the customer market and say, for example, let's focus on customers who are in the early part of their journey who don't actually know what they don't know yet. And therefore, if we give them a standard way of working and a recipe that is functional out of the box and compliant with best practices, then that allows them to jump into the process and have a certain degree of maturity on day one, which will be constrained in its ability to do all the things that they want, but will allow them to work their way through the journey of understanding the overall complexity one problem at a time. So they get to follow the recipe, and then every time they need to do something that's outside the standard, then they can focus on, well, what do I need to know in order to extend this capability to solve my specific problem? And it's a way of providing a tool that's also a teaching system. So people learn best practices by following the way the tool structures things, and they get a lot of the concepts on board by habit rather than by rote learning.
Yeah, I really like what you said there. We need to build tools that are teaching systems, right? I think that's really important, because I know, my background, right, is mostly in sort of the hands-on keyboard CI/CD stuff, with like inside of systems like Jenkins, Tekton, et cetera. And one of the problems is without the right sorts of guardrails around some of that sort of stuff, it's like, yes, you might be using a CI or CD tool, but you're not actually following CI or CD practices, and you're not, doing all the right things to actually get you the benefits out of them. And it's like you need those guardrails to help you stay focused around those sorts of things, while still, I think, allowing the flexibility at the organizational level, right? Because every organization is going to have its own approaches to how it wants to deliver products. And if you restrict it in a way that doesn't allow them to deliver the products in a way that they want to, right, while still following those rules, they're just going to figure out a way to work around it.
Yeah. And I think that's where something like Jenkins X is actually quite successful, because it's easy to set up an out-of-the-box solution and use quick starts to build projects that already have all the bits in place that you need. And then you're starting from a known good position and modifying things to work outwards towards where you need to be. And I think that sort of on rails approach is very valuable when you're moving into an area where there's significant conceptual change, and the learning curve is pretty much vertical. If you have to build a Kubernetes instance from first principles without understanding anything about Kubernetes, that's a very tough ask.
Yeah. That's definitely true. And also because what you see, or what I have seen, is that the difficulty can be to make sure that we are actually testing things properly, they're testing the correct things, that you get people involved that need to need to make their say on how to describe in detail what they want. And the collaboration part of all of this is very important to make a good product.
Yeah, so I think it's one of those cases where there are patterns and there are implementations. And so if we can be a bit more explicit about describing what the patterns are, then we can end up with a lot of different tools. But if we can make those tools align to the patterns and get some interoperability between the the naming standards and the approaches at some level, then we're doing a lot for the overall cause of continuous delivery as a methodology, but still giving people a lot of freedom to take a set of tools and shape them to exactly what they need from them. One of the things that I like to remind people is that continuous delivery doesn't sit at the software engineering level. It sits at the product level. And nowadays, product is not just software, it's machine learning, it's semiconductors, it's physical hardware. And so if you are going to have a proper continuous delivery tool set, that needs to be able to treat software assets, machine learning assets, and the semiconductor assets as the same thing. They all need to be part of a unified product delivery process, and you need to be able to combine all of those assets interlinked into a defined product release. And certainly if you look at what's going on in some of the larger organizations, especially in places like Apple, where your product is a physical object with a huge amount of software behind it, you need to very closely tie those things together, because if you allow them to drift too far apart, you end up with something that looks like it's very unstable and unreliable. And part of that commercial advantage that Apple have is that they're extremely good at managing their supply chain in both the physical and the software space. So all of these pieces get tightly aligned, and they're hitting specific beats on that release process.
Just to circle, to circle back on some of the comments that were said earlier, from the CDF perspective, security is very important. So, and across the board for enterprise and also open source projects. So we don't think that, like from how we're beginning to think about it, it's not just, CD is not just primarily concerned with the DORA metrics, but also security being vital. And that maybe for open source projects, the DORA metrics are less relevant, but security certainly is. So that's maybe an overlap, a very strong overlap between open source and enterprise products that concern with security.
Cool. Yeah, makes sense. At least I would hope so, right? Like, I think we should all be concerned about security.
Yeah.
So does anyone else have anything they want to bring up in the last few minutes?
So no, the only thing I was just gonna sort of say was, yeah, I will probably open up a PR to your branch with some stuff regarding audit and security engineering.
Great, thank you. Okay, right, well, thanks everyone. That was another useful session. And look forward to seeing some contributions into the documentation pack.
Great, thanks, Joe.
Cheers all.
Thanks. I'll try to make it in time next time.